The Cincinnati winter was merciless. A bitter wind howled through the empty streets, carrying the scent of damp asphalt and distant car exhaust. Street lights cast a cold bluish glow over the sidewalks where few pedestrians hurried past, bundled up against the freezing air. Sergeant H.R.I. Kessler barely noticed cold. He had only been back from deployment for a few days, trying to settle into civilian life. But something felt off. An unease set deep in his chest, an inexplicable weight pressing against his ribs. Then he saw it. A dog. A German shepherd lay curled up on the sidewalk near a concrete bench. His fur was matted with dirt, his ribs protruding from his frail body. His eyes were half open, glazed over, holding no light, no fight. His legs twitched slightly, shivering from the cold or exhaustion. People passed him without a second glance. To them, he was just another stray, another forgotten soul lost in the cracks of the city. But to H.R.I., he was everything. And then he saw the scar. The jagged scar above the right eye. Henry's stomach clenched so hard, he felt like he had been punched. No, it couldn't be. But the scar, it was FCO. The dog who had fought beside him. The dog who had saved his life. His brother. And now FCO was here, abandoned, starving, dying alone on the cold pavement. H.R.I. dropped to his knees. His breath hitched, his pulse hammering in his ears. He tried to speak, but his throat locked up. Memories came flooding back. The deafening roar of explosions, FCO charging ahead into danger, the feeling of that powerful body slamming against him, shoving him out of harm's way. And now that same warrior lay before him, broken. FCO, it's me, buddy, he whispered. First, nothing. No reaction. Just slow, shallow breaths. Then a flicker. A slight shift in those dull eyes. A hesitation. A faint recognition. FCO's tail, one so full of life, moved barely, like a dying ember trying to spark back to life. It was weak, almost nothing. But to H.R.I., it meant everything. Then a voice broke the moment. You know this dog? H.R.I. turned sharply, his vision blurred. Standing behind him was an older man. His white hair was disheveled, his long black coat buttoned up tightly against the cold. He held a worn leash in his frail hands, his face etched with something that looked like regret. He was my partner, H.R.I.'s voice cracked. My brother in war. The old man let out a long, shaky sigh, his eyes dark with something unspoken. Then you need to hear what happened to him before it's too late. What happened to FCO? Who was this mysterious man, and what secrets did he hold? H.R.I. had reunited with his battle brother, but what he was about to discover could change everything. Want to know what happens next? Then don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. We're so close to 100,000 subscribers, and every single one of you is part of this incredible journey. Turn on notifications, so you'll be the first to see the next part of this emotional story. Let's hit this milestone together. Henry's fingers trembled as he reached out, gently brushing the matted fur on FCO's neck. The dog flinched at the touch, a sharp breath escaping his cracked lips. That hesitation, it shattered H.R.I. FCO had never once recoiled from him before. They had been inseparable partners in war, bound by trust. But now that bond had been severed, replaced by something that felt dangerously close to fear. The old man shifted on his feet, clearing his throat. His eyes flickered with something. Guilt, maybe. You should take him, soldier. His voice was rough, aged like old leather. I don't think he's got much time left. Henry's jaw clenched, his mind a storm. Who was this man? Why did he have FCO? And most of all, how the hell did FCO end up like this? How long had he been out here? Henry's voice was low, almost dangerous. The man exhaled, shifting his weight. Not long, maybe a week. But he wasn't much better before that. Henry's eyes snapped up, sharp as a blade. Not much better before that. Who had him? His voice was colder now, the old military edge creeping back in. The man hesitated, looking away. His fingers tightened around the leash, knuckles whitening. You're not going to like the answer, son. Henry's blood ran cold. FCO whimpered softly, his frail body shivering under Henry's touch. His ears twitched at the sound of his old friend's voice, but he didn't move. He was too weak. H.R.I. swallowed hard. Tell me, he demanded. The old man exhaled again, his breath visible in the cold air. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. The military sold him. Henry's stomach twisted. He felt like he had been punched in the gut. The word barely escaped his lips. The old man nodded slowly. He was deemed unfit for service after his last mission. No retirement ceremony, no honor, just paperwork. And then he was sold like surplus gear. Henry's vision blurred with rage. They sold FCO? The dog, who had put his life on the line over and over again? The dog who had taken a bullet for him? The military, the people he had both served with and bled for, had discarded him like trash. His hands clenched into fists. This couldn't be real. Who bought him? His voice was low, deadly. The old man hesitated again, then sighed. A private security firm. But they didn't treat him right. Overworked him, starved him. When he couldn't perform anymore, they dumped him just like the military did. HRI had heard enough. His best friend had been betrayed by the system, by the people he trusted, by the very country they fought for. And now, FCO was here, barely alive because of it. A storm raged inside HRI. Someone was going to pay for this. Henry's body felt like it was on fire, not from the cold, but from rage. His fingers curled into fists so tight, his knuckles turned white. He had seen a lot of cruelty in his years of service, but this was personal. FCO had fought beside him, had saved his life more times than he could count, and they had thrown him away like nothing. His pulse pounded in his ears as he turned to the old man. Where? His voice was low, dangerous. Where was he last kept? The man hesitated, his weathered face creased with something between guilt and sorrow. Look, son, I don't know what you're thinking, but that place, it's not somewhere you just walk into. He rubbed his hands together, glancing down at FCO, who barely stirred. And even if you do, it won't change what's already been done. Henry's teeth clenched so hard, his jaw ached. Wouldn't change anything, he growled. That's the kind of excuse people give when they're too scared to act, when they want to forget. Tell me, he demanded. The old man exhaled long and slow. He knew there was no stopping HRI now. Baldwin Security, off the I-275, just outside the city. His voice was quiet, like he almost regretted saying it out loud. HRI committed the name to memory. He had never heard of them, but it didn't matter. They were the ones who had done this to FCO. That was all he needed to know. A soft whimper pulled Henry's attention back to the ground. FCO's breathing was shallow, his ribs rising and falling with visible effort. He was fading. Henry's chest tightened. He couldn't afford to let his anger take over. Not yet. I need to get him help, he muttered, more to himself than to the old man. The old man nodded. There's a vet clinic a few blocks down. But listen, he hesitated before continuing. You need to be careful, son. These men, they don't play by the rules. And if they find out you're coming, HRI didn't let him finish. Then they'll learn what happens when you mess with a soldier's family. His voice was cold, steady, with careful hands. HRI scooped FCO up, cradling the broken dog against his chest. He expected resistance, but FCO barely reacted. He was too weak. HRI swallowed the lump in his throat. It wasn't too late. Couldn't be. As he turned, his mind was already racing. First, save FCO. Make sure he survived. But after that, someone was going to pay. Henry's boots pounded against the wet pavement as he carried FCO through the cold Cincinnati streets. Every step felt like a battle against time. The dog in his arms, once a warrior, once unstoppable, now felt weightless. His body too thin, too fragile. FCO's breathing was uneven, labored. His head rested against Henry's chest, eyes barely open. He was slipping away. Stay with me, buddy. Just a little longer. Henry's voice was rough, almost desperate. They had been through hell before. He had seen men take their last breaths in the dirt, fought to keep them alive long enough to get to safety. But this was different. This wasn't just another soldier. This was FCO. The old man's words echoed in his head. Baldwin Security. A name HRI wouldn't forget. Not after what they had done. But revenge could wait. Right now, saving FCO was all that mattered. Then, in the distance, hope, a red neon sign flickered against the dark sky. 24-hour emergency vet clinic. HRI pushed forward, ignoring the burn in his muscles, the ice in his lungs. He nearly slammed into the clinic's glass doors, kicking them open with his boot. I need help now. A woman in blue scrubs rushed from behind the counter, eyes widening as she took in sight before her. The soldier in full uniform, drenched in sweat, holding a half-dead German shepherd in his arms. Oh my God, get into the back now. HRI followed as two vet techs rushed forward, taking FCO from his arms. The sudden loss of his weight made Henry's chest feel empty. He tried to follow, but a firm hand pressed against his chest. Sir, let us work. HRI didn't argue. He just stood there, fists clenched, jaw tight, watching as FCO was rushed through a set of double doors. And then he was gone. The silence that followed was unbearable. HRI felt his breath shaking, his pulse still racing. He had been in situations like this before, waiting to hear if a brother in arms would make it. But nothing had ever felt as personal, as painful as this. A voice broke the quiet. What happened to him? HRI turned. The woman in scrubs stood beside him, eyes filled with concern. Her name tag read Dr. Lillian Carter. For a second, HRI couldn't speak. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to find words. He was in the military, served with me overseas. But after his last mission, they sold him. His voice was tight, controlled. The people who took him, they didn't take care of him. When he was no longer useful, they threw him away. Dr. Carter's lips pressed into a thin line. She had seen abused animals before, but this was something else. We'll do everything we can, she said softly. HRI nodded, but his mind was already somewhere else. He couldn't just sit here, waiting, hoping FCO didn't get left behind in war. And he sure as hell wasn't going to be left behind now. He pulled out his phone, his hand steady despite the fury boiling inside him. It was time to find out everything there was to know about Baldwin Security. HRI sat in the cold, sterile waiting room, his elbows resting on his knees, fingers locked together so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The air smelled of antiseptic and quiet desperation. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, and the ticking clock on the wall only made time feel slower. FCO was in there, fighting, and for the first time in years, HRI felt truly helpless. He had been trained to react, to act under pressure. But now all he could do was sit and wait. And he hated it. His jaw tightened as his mind kept circling back to the same name, Baldwin Security. The old man's words still echoed in his head. They used him. Then they threw him away. HRI pulled out his phone, his fingers steady despite the rage boiling inside him. A quick search revealed a well-polished website full of patriotic slogans and images of security teams in tactical gear. They boasted about providing elite protection for corporate executives and high-profile clients. But Henry knew better. This wasn't a security company. It was something darker. He dug deeper, scanning online forums and military watchdog sites, until he found something that made his blood turn to ice. A hidden post. Baldwin Security has been buying up retired K-9s from the military. They push them to the brink, no medical care, no proper food. When the dogs break, they dump them. If you serve with AK-9, check on them. They might be in danger. Henry's stomach twisted. This wasn't just about FCO. There were others, other war heroes discarded like broken equipment, left to suffer and die alone. Before he could process the full weight of what he had just read, a door swung open. Dr. Carter stepped into the waiting room, her face unreadable as she pulled off her gloves. HRI shot up from his seat, his heart pounding. The silence stretched between them like a loaded gun. How is he? Henry's voice was sharp, carrying the kind of urgency only a soldier could have. Dr. Carter sighed. He's stable for now. Relief washed over Henry for a brief second, but then she continued. But his condition is critical. He's malnourished, dehydrated, and suffering from multiple untreated injuries. And the worst part, there are signs of abuse. HRI felt his pulse spike. Abuse. It wasn't enough that they had overworked him. They had hurt him. The same dog that had once been willing to die for his handler had been beaten by the hands that were supposed to protect him. His vision blurred with anger, but Dr. Carter placed a steadying hand on his arm. He's strong, but he needs time and care. And most of all, he needs you. HRI swallowed hard, looking past her toward the doors where FCO was still fighting for his life. He had failed him once by not being there when he was taken. He wouldn't fail him again. But deep in his gut, he knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. Baldwin Security thought they could get away with this. They were wrong. The story is intense. What would you do if you discovered a company was mistreating the very heroes that served alongside soldiers? Do you think HRI should seek justice or take matters into his own hands? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. HRI stood outside the clinic, his breath visible in the freezing night air. His body was still, but his mind was a battlefield. Memories of FCO at his strongest clashed against the reality of the broken dog lying on that vet's table. He had trusted the system to take care of his partner. That trust had been betrayed. And now, someone had to answer for it. His fingers hovered over his phone screen, his pulse steady despite the fury coiling inside him. He wasn't just going to let this go. He had seen men like the ones running Baldwin Security before, mercenaries who cared about nothing but money, treating loyalty like a disposable commodity. He scrolled through contacts he hadn't used in years, old names from his military past. He wasn't alone. There were others, men who had served, who had fought, who had lost more than they should have, men who would want justice. The sound of the clinic door opening behind him pulled him from his thoughts. Dr. Carter stepped out, pulling her coat tighter around her shoulders. She hesitated before speaking. He's sleeping now, but it's going to be a long road to recovery. HRY nodded, but his jaw was still tight. He knew what she wasn't saying. Fun's body had been pushed too far. Even if he survived, he might never be the same. The military had trained him to obey, to fight, to protect. But who had protected him? No one. Not until now. Dr. Carter watched him carefully. "Whatever you're planning," she said slowly, "be careful. These kind of people don't just let things go." HRY exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Neither do I." As she walked away, HRY turned back to his phone. His thumb hovered over a single name, someone who could get him the information he needed, someone who still had access to military records, supply chains, and the people who had made FCO suffer. He pressed the call button. The line rang once, twice, then a voice on the other end. "Kessler, it's been a long time." Henry's eyes darkened. His grip tightened around the phone. "I need a favor, and I don't care what it costs." HRY gripped the phone tighter as the voice on the other end let out a slow, knowing exhale. Luke Calloway, a name HRY hadn't spoken in years. A former intelligence officer, one of the best. He had a talent for finding the truth in places no one wanted it found. But he had left that life behind, disappearing into the shadows when the system turned on him. Calling him was a risk, but right now, risk didn't matter. FCO deserved justice. "Kessler," Luke's voice was low, cautious. "You don't call someone like me unless you're standing in the middle of a damn storm." HRY glanced back through the clinic's glass doors. FCO was in there, fighting for his life. And outside in the real world, the men who had done this to him were still walking free. That wasn't going to last much longer. He took a breath, steady but filled with purpose. "I need everything you can find on Baldwin Security." His voice was hard, unwavering. "Every contract, every handler, every dirty deal. I don't care if it's classified. Dig it up." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Luke wasn't stupid. He could hear the controlled rage in Henry's voice, and he knew that when a soldier spoke like that, it meant war. Jesus, man, what the hell did they do? Luke finally asked. HRY swallowed the bitter taste in his mouth, his teeth grinding as the memories rushed back. FCO at his strongest, standing beside him in the field. The sound of his bark cutting through gunfire, the feel of his body slamming into HRY, saving him from explosion. And then the image of him now, thin, weak, left to die in the streets like trash. HRY clenched his jaw. "They took my partner," he said, his voice like steel. They used him, broke him, then dumped him when he wasn't useful anymore. Another silence, then a slow breath from Luke. You know, if I do this, there's no turning back, right? Henry's grip on the phone didn't waver. He had already made his choice the second he saw FCO lying there on the pavement. I'm not turning back, he said. I'm finishing this. HRY sat in his truck, the engine idling as the city lights flickered in the distance. The weight of his phone in his hand felt heavier than usual. He knew what he had just set in motion. Luke Calloway wasn't the kind of man who asked twice. Once he started digging, the truth would come out, whether HRY was ready for it or not. And the truth had consequences. His fingers drummed against the steering wheel as he exhaled slowly, forcing himself to think. He had spent years following orders, living by the book. But this was different. This was personal. FCO wasn't just a K9. He was family. And Baldwin Security had treated him like nothing, like a disposable weapon. That kind of betrayal didn't get swept under the rug. Not if HRY had anything to do with it. His phone vibrated, the screen lighting up. Luke, that was fast. HRY answered without hesitation. Tell me you have something. Oh, I have a lot of something. Luke's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. And none of it is good. He paused, then continued. Baldwin Security isn't just buying retired K9s. They're running illegal training facilities. No oversight, no regulations. They take the dogs, work them into the ground, and when they break, a bitter laugh. They sell them off. Some end up on the black market. Some get put down. And the lucky ones, they get dumped like FCO. Henry's grip tightened around the phone, his pulse pounding in his ears. Who's behind it? His voice was quiet, dangerous. Luke hesitated, and that hesitation told HRY everything he needed to know. This went deeper than just one corrupt company. You're not going to like this, Luke finally said. Baldwin CO, ex-military. Lieutenant Colonel James Holloway. Ring any bells? Henry's stomach twisted. Of course it did. Holloway had been a commanding officer in Afghanistan. One of the old-school types who saw soldiers and canines as tools, not people. He had been ruthless, willing to burn through men and dogs alike if it meant completing the mission. And now he was profiting off the very same warriors he used to command. Henry's jaw tightened. This wasn't just about FCO anymore. Send me everything you have, he said, because this bastard just made my list. HRY stared at the name glowing on his phone screen. Lieutenant Colonel James Holloway. The letters felt like a brand, searing into his mind, reigniting a fury he hadn't felt in years. This wasn't just a corrupt businessman. This was personal. Holloway had been more than just a commanding officer. He had been the kind of leader who saw men and dogs alike as tools, useful only as long as they performed. When they broke, they were discarded, forgotten, erased. HRY had seen it firsthand overseas. Soldiers being pushed past their breaking points. K9 units sent into situations they weren't meant to survive. And now, that same ruthless bastard had turned his cruelty into profit. A slow exhale left Henry's lungs, controlled but laced with pure rage. On the other end of the line, Luke Calloway's voice cut through the silence. Holloway isn't just running a dirty business, Kessler. There was a pause, like Luke was debating whether or not to say what came next. But then his voice hardened. He's covering up the deaths of these dogs. And not just a few, a lot. Another silence, heavier this time. The numbers don't add up. Official records show a handful of retired K9s each year. But based on what I pulled, there are dozens, maybe hundreds that just disappear. Henry's grip on the phone tightened. Disappear? The word made his stomach twist. He had believed, naively, foolishly, that the system he served would take care of FCO, that every military working dog was given the retirement they deserved. Instead, Holloway had turned their loyalty into a business, squeezing every last drop of usefulness from them before tossing their broken bodies aside. HRY had seen war break men, but this was something worse. This was deliberate. This was murder. Tell me you have an address, HRY said, his voice dangerously calm. Luke let out a low, humorless chuckle. Oh, I got more than that. Holloway doesn't just sit in an office and let his men do the dirty work. He oversees everything personally. And right now, he's at a private compound in Kentucky, just outside Lexington. No official records, no government oversight, just a heavily guarded training facility where no one asks questions. There was a brief pause before Luke added, "And Kessler, he's there tonight." Henry's pulse thundered in his ears. This was it. The name, the location, the man responsible. Holloway thought he was untouchable, that no one would come looking, that no one would care. He was wrong. Henry's voice was steady, lethal. "Final. Send me everything you have." HRY drove in silence, the glow of his dashboard casting sharp shadows across his face. The road stretched endlessly ahead, dark and empty, leading straight into the heart of Kentucky, straight to Holloway. His fingers flexed around the steering wheel, muscles tense, jaw clenched so hard it ached. Every mile that passed was 1 mile closer to justice. Not the kind found in courtrooms, not the kind written in reports. Real justice. The kind men like Holloway never saw coming. Luke's intel had been thorough. The facility wasn't just some abandoned warehouse. It was a full-scale, off-the-book training compound, armed guard, surveillance, restricted access. It was designed to keep people out, or more likely, to keep secrets in. HRY had seen places like it before overseas, the kind where things happened that were never meant to see the light of day, where men like Holloway operated without consequences. But tonight, there would be consequences. Henry's phone vibrated on the seat beside him. He glanced at the screen. "Luke." He pressed the speaker button without taking his eyes off the road. "Tell me you're not about to do something stupid." Luke's voice was half warning, half resigned acceptance. HRY exhaled slow and controlled. Not stupid. His voice was steady, ice cold. Necessary. A silence stretched between them before Luke sighed. "Look, I pulled more files. Holloway isn't working alone. He's got powerful backers, government ties. If you go in there, you're not just making enemies. You're setting fire to something bigger than you realize." Henry's hands tightened around the wheel. "That didn't change anything. I don't care how deep this goes." His voice was razor sharp. "He left FCO to die in the street. He put his hands on my partner. And if he's done it once, he'll do it again. That ends tonight." Another long pause. Then finally, Luke let out a low chuckle. "Well, hell, if you're going to war, might as well not go in alone." A message popped up on Henry's screen. Coordinates, not just for the compound, but for something else. An entry point, a weak spot. Unra smirked. Luke knew him too well. "Appreciate it." Luke sighed again. "Just don't get yourself killed." And Kessler, a beat of silence. "Make it count." HRY ended the call and pressed his foot down on the gas. The engine roared as the car surged forward. The hunt was over. It was time to finish this. No more running. Not for FCO. Not for anyone. If you're hooked on the story and want to see how it all ends, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It really helps bring more stories like this and ensures you don't miss the next chapter. What will HRI do when he finally faces Holloway? Will he get justice for FCO? Drop your theories in the comments below and turn on notifications to be the first to watch the dramatic conclusion. Next episode coming soon. Stay tuned.